On the morning of September 21st, 1956, a Grumman test pilot named Tom Attridge climbed into the cockpit of an experimental fighter jet at the Grumman airfield on Long Island, New York. It was a routine day. He was scheduled to run a standard weapons test over the Atlantic Ocean, firing the aircraft's four 20mm cannons in a shallow supersonic dive to verify their performance at high speed. It was the kind of test he had done many times before. He was one of the most experienced pilots in the company, a former Navy aviator who had flown in the Second World War, and a man who knew this aircraft better than almost anyone alive. He would take off that morning as a routine test pilot. He would land in a hospital less than an hour later as the first pilot in the history of aviation to shoot himself down. His aircraft, a brand new supersonic fighter called the Grumman F-11 Tiger, would be destroyed. Its engine would tear itself apart in midair. Its canopy would shatter. Its wing would break. And when the wreckage was eventually recovered, engineers would find something that had never before been documented in the history of powered flight. A live 20mm cannon round, undischarged, still perfectly intact, lodged deep inside the airframe of the very aircraft that had fired it. The bullet had not come from an enemy. It had not come from a training partner. It had not come from friendly fire. It had come from his own guns. Attridge had flown so fast in such a specific geometry of dive that his own bullets had crossed his own path and shot him out of the sky. This is the story of how it happened. It is a story about physics, about design, about the specific moment in the history of aviation when aircraft became faster than the weapons they carried, and about a test pilot who survived a collision with his own gunfire and lived the rest of his life carrying a warning that would eventually be built into every modern fighter cockpit on Earth. It is also, in a strange way, the story of a man who nearly killed himself with his own machine and then went on to help send other men to the moon. But to understand what happened over Long Island that morning, you first have to understand the airplane. The Grumman F-11 Tiger was born out of frustration. In the early 1950s, Grumman, one of the most respected naval aircraft manufacturers in the United States, was watching the world of jet aviation change faster than its own production lines could keep up. The company's existing carrier fighter, the F-9 Cougar, was a solid subsonic aircraft, but subsonic was already yesterday's technology. The future belonged to whichever manufacturer could put a reliable supersonic fighter onto the deck of an American aircraft carrier, and in 1952, Grumman decided to build one. The engineering team started, in theory, as an improvement to the Cougar. Within a very short time, that plan collapsed. Nothing about a subsonic airframe could be gently upgraded to Mach 1 performance. The wing needed to be redesigned. The fuselage needed to be reshaped. The intakes, the tail, the flight controls, all of it needed to be re-engineered from the ground up. What began as a modification became an entirely new aircraft. The result was the F-11 Tiger, and when you look at photographs of it today, you can immediately see the ambition behind it. The fuselage is long, sleek, and famously narrow at the middle, following what engineers of that era called the area rule, a principle borrowed from wind tunnel research that dictated a specific Coke bottle shape to reduce transonic drag. The wings are thin, sharply swept, and remarkably small for the size of the aircraft. Instead of conventional ailerons, the Tiger used spoilers on the upper surfaces of its wings for roll control. Everything about the design was oriented toward one goal: getting an American naval fighter reliably past the speed of sound. It worked. The Tiger became the first supersonic aircraft ever produced by Grumman. It could exceed 900 miles per hour. In one of its most impressive early achievements, a specially modified F-11 set a world altitude record of nearly 77,000 feet. The United States Navy flew it. The Blue Angels, the Navy's elite flight demonstration team, adopted it as their showpiece aircraft for years, delighting airshow audiences across America with its speed and precision. But there was one thing about the F-11 Tiger that had not fully caught up with the rest of its design: its guns. The Tiger carried four Colt Mk-12 20mm cannons, one of the most respected guns of its era. Each cannon could fire around 1,000 rounds per minute. Each shell left the barrel at roughly 3,300 feet per second, which is close to Mach 3 at sea level. On paper, that sounds fast. In practice, it was fast, but only relative to the world of subsonic aircraft the gun had been designed for. The Mk-12 was, in engineering terms, an evolution of weapons whose fundamental concepts stretched back to the Second World War. The gun had been designed for aircraft flying at maybe 600, 700, 800 miles per hour. It had never been designed with the assumption that the aircraft firing it might itself be moving nearly as fast as its own bullets. And this is where physics stops being a background factor and becomes the main character of the story. When a bullet leaves a gun on a stationary aircraft on the ground, it starts life travelling at somewhere around 3,300 feet per second in a straight line toward its target. When the same gun fires from an aircraft moving forward at, say, 800 feet per second, the bullet inherits that additional velocity. Its total speed relative to the ground is now around 4,100 feet per second. For a brief moment after firing, the bullet is one of the fastest objects in the sky. But the moment the bullet leaves the barrel, two forces begin to attack that speed immediately. The first is gravity. Every second the bullet is in the air, gravity is pulling it downward at roughly 9.81 meters per second squared. The bullet does not fly straight, no matter how fast it leaves the muzzle. It follows a curve, a ballistic arc, that starts to bend downward the moment the shot is fired. The second force is drag, aerodynamic drag scales, roughly speaking with the square of the object's velocity. That means a bullet moving at Mach 3 is not experiencing 3 times as much drag as a bullet moving at Mach 1. It is experiencing something closer to 9 times as much drag. The faster the bullet is going, the harder the atmosphere is pushing back against it. And because a bullet has an extremely small mass compared to its cross-sectional area, drag eats its speed with staggering efficiency. Within just a few seconds after firing, a bullet that left the barrel at Mach 3 has already lost a huge fraction of its initial velocity. In another second or two, it will have lost more. The bullet is slowing down constantly, curving downward constantly, and moving away from the aircraft that fired it in a very specific arc that physics calls a ballistic trajectory. Meanwhile, the aircraft that fired it is doing the opposite. The aircraft has an engine. The aircraft is producing thrust. The aircraft is not slowing down. And if that aircraft is in a dive, the aircraft is actually accelerating, both because of thrust and because of gravity acting along the direction of travel. The bullet is dying. The aircraft is not. Now imagine what happens if the aircraft is diving at exactly the right angle, at exactly the right speed, for exactly the right amount of time. The bullets fly out ahead of the aircraft in an arc that begins to curve downward and slow down. The aircraft continues along its own dive path, gaining speed as it descends, and if those two paths, the bullet's arc and the aircraft's dive, happen to intersect at the same point in space at the same moment in time, the aircraft is going to fly directly through its own gunfire. This is not a common event. It requires an almost specific combination of geometry, speed, and timing, but it is not impossible, and on the morning of September 21st, 1956, over the coast of Long Island, Tom Attridge became the first pilot in history to prove it. Attridge was flying Grumman F-11 Tiger on 138.620. The plan for the test was simple. He would climb to around 22,000 feet, enter a shallow dive of about 20 degrees, accelerate to Mach 1, and fire 2 short bursts from his 20mm cannons, roughly midway through the dive. He would then continue descending to about 7,000 feet and return to base. It was, by his own experience, a completely standard weapons profile. He reached altitude. He rolled into the dive. He hit Mach 1. He fired the first burst. A moment later, he fired the second burst. He continued the dive as planned, descending through the mid-teens of thousands of feet, still accelerating, still following his exact planned geometry. And then, about 11 seconds after he had squeezed the trigger, something hit his aircraft. Attridge felt the impact and heard damage almost simultaneously. The canopy in front of him fractured. A section of his engine intake was struck. The aircraft's behavior began to change. His first thought, the same thought almost any pilot in that situation would have, was that he had hit a bird. Long Island had plenty of birds, and even small birds at high speed can shatter the front of an aircraft. But something did not fit. The damage pattern was wrong. The engine had been hit, and hit hard. Something inside the intake was starting to come apart. The aircraft was becoming unresponsive in ways that a simple bird strike would not usually produce. Attridge did what a trained test pilot does. He throttled back. He reduced his speed to around 230 miles per hour. He turned toward the airfield and tried to nurse the aircraft home. But the engine was already tearing itself apart inside. Debris was passing through the compressor. Vibrations were building, and with about 2 miles left to run to the runway, the engine finally gave up completely. The Tiger lost power. The aircraft caught fire. A wing came off. Attridge was now in an uncontrolled crash landing over wooded terrain. He came down in a forest short of the runway. The aircraft was destroyed. Miraculously, he survived. He climbed, or more accurately dragged himself, out of the burning wreckage before rescuers reached him. When his injuries were assessed, he had broken his leg, cracked 3 vertebrae, and suffered other significant trauma. He was alive, but he'd come very close to not being alive. The aircraft was a complete write-off, and that would probably have been the end of the story. filed in some Grumman internal report as a mysterious engine failure or an unusually severe bird strike, if not for what the wreckage recovery team found when they carefully sifted through what was left of Buno on 36 Tuelu. They found a bullet, a 20mm cannon round, undischarged, still intact, lodged into a section of the airframe. Once that bullet was found, the entire picture reassembled itself. This was not a bird. This was not random debris. This was Attridge's own ammunition. His own gun on his own aircraft had put a live round into his own airplane. Combined with the impact damage to the engine and the canopy, the conclusion became inescapable. 3 of Attridge's own 20mm cannon rounds had returned to intercept his own aircraft, roughly 11 seconds after he had fired them. Investigators reconstructed the physics of what had happened. It fit exactly. The aircraft had entered the dive, accelerated, fired at Mach 1, and then continued to accelerate downward, while the bullets, moving initially faster than the aircraft, had begun to slow down and drop as physics demanded. The bullet's trajectory curved downward and lost speed. The aircraft's trajectory continued downward and gained speed. About 11 seconds later, the two paths crossed. The aircraft flew straight through its own bullets. It was, in the coldest technical sense, an event predicted by basic ballistics equations, but never before demonstrated in flight. Attridge had, entirely by accident, performed the first empirical proof that a supersonic aircraft in a diving attack could catch up to and collide with its own gunfire. And here is where the story becomes even stranger, and, in its own way, more human. Attridge did not treat what had happened to him as a scandal. He did not treat it as an embarrassment to be buried. As soon as he recovered enough to speak with engineers, he sat down with the Grumman team and helped them reconstruct exactly what had gone wrong. He walked through the dive angle, the airspeed at each moment, the timing of the trigger pulls, the geometry of the flight path. He made himself, in effect, the primary source for the investigation into his own near-death experience. 6 months after the crash, he was back in the cockpit, testing aircraft, doing his job, adding this incident to the long list of things a good test pilot has survived. And then, over the next decade, Tom Attridge did something almost no aviation writer ever seems to mention when they tell this story. He rose inside Grumman to become a senior manager on one of the most important engineering programs of the 20th century. He was involved in the leadership of the Grumman Lunar Module program, the effort that produced the spacecraft in which Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended to the surface of the Moon in July 1969. The man who accidentally became the first pilot in history to shoot himself down helped build the machine that carried the first humans to another world. Meanwhile, the aircraft that had almost killed him, the Grumman F-11 Tiger, did not enjoy the same long career its designers had hoped for. The Tiger was fast, agile, and elegant, but it was almost immediately outclassed by other supersonic naval fighters, especially the Vought F-8 Crusader, which offered superior performance in most of the roles the Navy actually cared about. The Navy only ever ordered a small number of Tigers, and by 1961, just a few years after entering service, the F-11 had been withdrawn from frontline combat units. It survived in a training role and, most famously, as the display aircraft of the Blue Angels, who continued to fly it until 1968. For an aircraft that had briefly held a world altitude record and had been billed as one of the fastest fighters in the American inventory, the F-11's operational life was startlingly short. Attridge outlived the entire aircraft type by decades. He died in 1997, having spent much of his later life reflecting on the incident that had made him famous in aviation circles. In interviews, he offered one particularly memorable line about what he had learned that morning over Long Island. It has been quoted and paraphrased many times since. The essence of it is very simple. It doesn't pay to fly faster than your own bullets. That sentence, more than any incident report or engineering diagram, is really the heart of this story. Because what happened to Tom Attridge in 1956 was not just an unlucky accident. It was an early warning signal about a new class of problem that aviation was about to face on a much larger scale. The jet age was arriving, aircraft were becoming faster than the weapons they carried. And unless designers took that reality seriously, more incidents like Attridge's were going to happen. Only some of them would end in wreckage in a forest with a lucky survivor, and some of them would end in ways that no one wanted to write reports about. So the engineering world took the warning seriously, and you can see that warning in almost every fighter cockpit built since. Modern combat aircraft, from the F-15 to the F-16 to the F-A-18 to the F-22 to the F-35, are equipped with sophisticated fire control computers that constantly calculate the trajectory of any ordnance the aircraft might release, the future path of the aircraft itself, and the probability that those two paths will intersect. If the flight control system determines that a shot at a given moment, in a given geometry, would risk sending ordnance back into the aircraft's own path, the system can inhibit weapons release entirely. The pilot may pull the trigger, but the aircraft will not fire. In effect, every modern fighter carries, inside its avionics, a quiet acknowledgement of what happened to Tom Attridge over Long Island in 1956. The lesson has been baked into the software. The rule has been made into a system. Attridge's experience, painful and personal as it was, has become an invisible safety feature in cockpits flown by pilots who have never heard his name. That is the strange consolation of stories like this. A single test pilot, on a single dive, on a single morning, encounters a possibility that no one had previously demonstrated. He nearly dies. And then, quietly over the following decades, the entire architecture of modern combat aviation absorbs the lesson and rewrites its own rules so that no one else has to encounter that possibility in the same way. If you look at Attridge's incident purely as a curiosity, a piece of believe-it-or-not trivia, you miss what actually happened here. Because this was not just about one pilot's bad luck. It was about a specific moment in the history of technology when human machines finally moved fast enough to catch up to their own weapons. It was about the transition from an era in which pilots simply pointed and fired into an era in which pilots had to be protected by computers from the consequences of their own aircraft's speed. That transition is one of the quiet turning points of 20th century aviation. It marks the moment when the aircraft became fast enough that the physics of gunfire that had governed air combat since the First World War, no longer applied in the simple way pilots had assumed. Bullets were no longer just things that came out of the front of the airplane and went toward the enemy. Bullets were now objects in a ballistic environment that had to be reasoned about across time and space, in 3 dimensions, in relation to the aircraft's own trajectory. The gun did not become obsolete, it just stopped being a simple weapon. There is one more layer worth pausing on. Attridge's story does not have a villain. There was no corporate cover-up. There was no negligent engineer. There was no political scandal buried behind the incident. There was only a pilot doing his job, an aircraft doing its job, and the laws of physics behaving exactly as they had always behaved, being encountered for the first time in a combination that had not previously been tested. Nobody had done anything wrong. Everybody had done exactly what the state of aviation knowledge at that moment allowed them to do, and still the aircraft went down. That is a rare kind of story in aviation history. Most crashes have someone to blame. Most disasters have a chain of preventable errors. Attridge's crash has almost none of that. It has a pilot who did everything correctly, in an aircraft that was working as designed, with a weapon that was performing exactly as expected. The tragedy, if you can call it that, was simply that no one had yet realized that flying that specific profile, at that specific speed with that specific gun, would produce that specific outcome. It was a discovery, written in metal and fire, at the expense of one man's body and one aircraft's existence. Discoveries like that are how engineering fields learn. Slowly, painfully, one incident at a time. Someone survives, someone does not. The reports get written, the rules get changed, the software gets updated. The next generation flies with a small piece of that lesson built quietly into their machines. Tom Attridge understood that, in a way that made him one of the more thoughtful aviation figures of the post-war era. He did not spend his life haunted by the incident. He did not disappear from public view. He rebuilt. He returned to flight. He helped design spacecraft. He spoke about what had happened when asked, always with a mixture of professional precision and quiet humour. He treated his own near-death as essentially useful data. And the aircraft, Buno 138-620, was reduced to fragments in a Long Island forest. Somewhere among those fragments, the little cannon round that had told the entire story sat perfectly intact, waiting to be found and understood. It would be studied by engineers, referenced in reports, and eventually preserved as one of the strangest artifacts in the history of American naval aviation. A bullet that had come home to its own aircraft, at supersonic speeds, and had lived to tell the tale even after its target had burned. There is something almost poetic about that image. A bullet outliving the aircraft that fired it. A bullet that travelled in an arc predicted by physics equations written more than 2 centuries earlier, encountered by a pilot who had no reason to suspect that his own gun could reach him, and preserved in the end as a physical reminder that speed itself, on a fast enough machine, becomes its own kind of danger. That is the real lesson of the Grumman F-11 Tiger and the day it shot itself down. The enemy is not always outside your aircraft. Sometimes, when your aircraft becomes fast enough and your weapons are still designed for a slower era, the enemy is the specific geometry of your own dive. The enemy is the trajectory of your own bullet. The enemy is a set of equations older than the airplane you're flying, waiting to be encountered by anyone unfortunate enough to fly through the exact wrong combination of angle, altitude, and time. Attridge encountered those equations first. He survived them. He warned everyone who came after him, and every combat pilot alive today, flying every modern fighter jet in every air force on Earth, is protected from repeating his mistake by systems that exist because he made it. That is not a bad legacy for a test pilot who thought he was going to fly a routine gun test one morning in September 1956. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten Cold War aviation history, subscribe to Veen History for more stories of the aircraft, engineers, and impossible moments that shaped the machines we still fly today. What Cold War aviation story should we cover next? Let us know in the comments.